If you sign that agreement today, you will hand this entire company to the wrong person. The sentence landed in the room like a dropped glass. For a brief second, the conversation at the long mahogany table faltered, then resumed as if the words had never been spoken. The executives seated beneath the bright conference lights barely glanced toward the corner where the voice had come from. In that corner sat a black woman with a simple leather notebook resting on her lap. Her pen moved steadily across the page, capturing every word spoken in the room. No one had invited her to speak. No one had asked her opinion. In their eyes, she was only the temporary meeting recorder, the quiet woman hired to document the minutes of a high-stakes corporate meeting on the 50th floor of Whitmore Financial Tower in Manhattan. Outside the massive windows, the skyline stretched for miles, sunlight reflecting off towers of glass and steel. Inside the boardroom, the air smelled faintly of polished wood, espresso, and expensive cologne. 12 executives in tailored suits debated the future of a company worth billions of dollars, speaking in confident voices about acquisitions, market leverage, and strategic exits. At the head of the table sat Richard Whitmore, the chief executive officer whose name was etched in silver letters on the side of the building itself. To his right sat Charles Langford, the most aggressive voice in the room and the man pushing hardest for the sale that was about to happen. Charles barely turned his head toward the woman who had spoken. He gave a short laugh, the kind people use when brushing away something insignificant. "Just record the minutes," he said calmly. "Leave the strategy to people who understand it." Several executives smiled politely. One man quietly tapped the table with his pen, signaling the discussion should continue. The woman in the corner did not respond. She simply lowered her eyes and resumed writing in her notebook, her handwriting precise and steady as if she were documenting something far more important than anyone in the room realized. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The meeting pressed forward. Charts glowed on the massive screen at the front of the room showing projected profits, debt restructuring plans, and the final contract that would transfer control of Whitmore Financial to an outside investment group. Charles Langford stood and walked slowly around the table as he spoke, his voice filled with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. "This deal protects our shareholders and secures the future of this company," he said. "It is the smartest move any of us can make today." Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. Assistants placed glasses of water beside the executives, while analysts quietly adjusted slides on their tablets. In the corner, the black woman continued writing. Naomi Carter had been told when she arrived that morning that her job was simple. Sit quietly. Record every word. Speak only if someone asked her to clarify a note. She had accepted the assignment without complaint. The simple navy suit she wore was neat but modest, the kind of outfit that allowed a person to disappear into the background of a room filled with powerful people. That was exactly what everyone expected her to do. Disappear. Charles returned to his seat and leaned back with a satisfied smile. "All that remains is the final vote," he said. Richard Whitmore looked down at the contract resting in front of him. The document was thick, filled with clauses and legal language that had taken months of negotiation to prepare. A pen waited beside his hand. Outside the window, a helicopter crossed the sky far below their level. Inside the room, the quiet scratching of Naomi Carter pen across paper was the only sound that continued uninterrupted. For a moment, Richard Whitmore glanced toward her. Something about the way she had spoken earlier lingered in his mind. It had not sounded like a random interruption. It had sounded like certainty. Still, the room moved on. Charles pushed the contract slightly toward the chief executive officer. "Go ahead, Richard," he said with a confident smile. "Sign it. Let us finish this." Naomi Carter paused mid-sentence. Her pen hovered just above the paper. And for the first time since the meeting began, she slowly raised her eyes and looked directly at the man holding the pen. The pen in Richard Whitmore's hand remained suspended above the paper. The room had grown quieter than before, not because anyone had asked for silence, but because the weight of the moment had begun to settle over the table. Outside, the Tall glass windows, the afternoon sun reflected off neighboring towers, casting long streaks of light across the polished surface of the boardroom table. Richard Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair instead of signing. Charles Langford noticed immediately. His confident smile faded just slightly. "Something wrong, Richard?" he asked with a tone that was still polite but now edged with impatience. Richard Whitmore did not answer right away. His eyes had drifted again toward the far corner of the room where Naomi Carter sat with her notebook. She had lowered her gaze again, writing as if the conversation had nothing to do with her. The scratching of her pen was quiet but steady, a soft rhythm against the otherwise tense silence. Richard cleared his throat and tapped the contract lightly with his fingers. "Before we finalize this vote," he said slowly, "I would like to review one part of the agreement again." Charles gave a short laugh. "Richard, we have reviewed that contract for months. Every attorney in the building has read it. The investors are waiting for your signature. There is nothing left to discuss." Around the table, several executives nodded in agreement. A senior analyst standing near the wall glanced nervously between the two men. Richard Whitmore was not known for hesitation. When he made a decision, he usually moved quickly. Yet now his attention shifted once more to Naomi Carter. "Miss Carter," he said calmly. Naomi looked up from her notebook. Her expression remained composed, almost neutral. "Yes, sir," she answered. "When you spoke earlier," Richard continued, "you said something about handing this company to the wrong person." Charles let out a sharp breath of annoyance. "Richard, she is here to take notes. She is not part of this discussion." Naomi Carter closed her notebook gently, but did not stand. "I understand that," she said quietly. "I apologize if I interrupted the meeting." Charles leaned forward across the table, his voice colder now. "Then perhaps you should allow the people responsible for this company to finish the work." Naomi nodded once. "Of course." She opened her notebook again as if the moment were finished. Richard Whitmore studied her for another few seconds. There was something unusual in the calm way she carried herself. Most temporary staff members in a room like this avoided eye contact with executives entirely. Yet Naomi Carter had spoken earlier without hesitation. It had not sounded like a guess. It had sounded like knowledge. Richard turned the contract slowly toward himself and began flipping through the pages again. The thick paper made a quiet rustling sound that echoed in the still room. Charles Langford shifted in his chair with visible irritation. "What exactly are you looking for, Richard?" he asked. Richard Whitmore stopped turning the pages when he reached a section near the center of the agreement. His brow tightened slightly. "Clause 17, he said quietly to himself. The words on the page described the structure of the financial transfer that would occur the moment the deal was signed. It outlined how the debt obligations of Whitmore Financial would be reassigned through a holding entity connected to the acquiring investors. Richard read the paragraph again, slower this time. A faint crease appeared between his eyebrows. Charles noticed the change immediately. "That section is standard restructuring language," he said quickly. "Our attorneys confirmed it last week." Richard Whitmore did not look up. Standard language does not usually move that much liability in a single clause, he replied. The room grew still again. One of the younger executives leaned closer to see the page. Another quietly opened a tablet and began searching through the digital version of the agreement. At the end of the long table, Naomi Carter remained seated with her pen resting lightly against the paper of her notebook. She had stopped writing. Her eyes were not on the contract. They were on Charles Langford. And for the first time since the meeting began, Charles Langford noticed that she was watching him. Charles Langford felt the shift in the room before anyone spoke. It was subtle, almost invisible, but he had spent decades in boardrooms learning how to read silence. The silence had changed. Moments earlier, the executives had been relaxed, confident, already imagining the celebration dinner that would follow the closing of the deal. Now several of them were leaning forward, their attention fixed on the open contract in front of Richard Whitmore. The chief executive officer continued reading Clause 17 slowly, his finger tracing each line as if he were searching for something hidden beneath the legal language. The light from the windows reflected across the polished table and illuminated the tension in his expression. Charles cleared his throat and forced a calm smile. "Richard," he said carefully, every line of that contract was reviewed by our legal department and by the external counsel hired for this deal. The restructuring language is completely standard for acquisitions of this scale. Richard Whitmore did not immediately respond. His eyes remained on the page. Standard language does not usually redirect that level of financial exposure, he said quietly. Around the table, a few executives began whispering to one another. One of the analysts near the wall stepped forward and pulled the contract onto his tablet, scrolling rapidly through the digital version. The young man paused when he reached the section Richard was studying. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Charles noticed and felt a flicker of irritation. The analyst looked up at Richard. "Sir," he said cautiously, "this clause appears to transfer a significant portion of the existing debt obligations into a secondary holding structure that is not directly controlled by Whitmore Financial." Charles leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, maintaining the appearance of patience. "That is exactly how restructuring works," he replied. "The debt is consolidated before the acquisition is finalized. It protects the acquiring investors from unnecessary exposure." Richard Whitmore finally lifted his head and looked across the table. "Protects the acquiring investors," he repeated slowly. His voice was calm, but the room could feel the weight behind the words. Charles gave a confident nod. "Precisely. That is how we ensure the transaction closes smoothly." The analysts and executives exchanged uneasy glances. Several of them had clearly trusted Charles Langford to guide the negotiations. He had been the loudest voice supporting the sale for weeks. Yet the way Richard was studying the contract now made some of them wonder if something important had been overlooked. At the far end of the table, Naomi Carter remained seated with her notebook closed in front of her. She had not resumed writing. Instead, she watched the conversation unfold with the quiet stillness of someone who had already reached a conclusion long before anyone else in the room. Richard Whitmore turned another page and then returned again to Clause 17. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read the final paragraph. Then he looked up again. "Charles," he said slowly, "who exactly controls the holding entity listed here?" Charles answered immediately, as if the question were obvious. "A consortium of investors represented by the acquiring firm." Richard Whitmore tapped the page with his finger. "The language here says the debt structure transfers control through a layered acquisition channel. The holding entity receives the majority claim once the restructuring completes." Charles nodded again. "Yes, that is part of the financing arrangement." Richard Whitmore leaned back in his chair and studied him carefully. "And who owns that holding entity?" For the first time, Charles hesitated. The pause lasted only a second, but everyone in the room noticed it. A faint smile touched the corner of Naomi Carter's mouth before disappearing just as quickly. Charles straightened his jacket and spoke with forced confidence. "The ownership structure will be finalized once the acquisition closes. That is standard procedure for deals of this magnitude." Richard Whitmore remained silent for several seconds. The room felt tighter now, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Finally, he looked away from Charles and glanced once more toward Naomi Carter. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. Naomi lifted her eyes again. "Yes, sir. Earlier you suggested this agreement would give the company to the wrong person." Richard Whitmore paused before finishing the sentence. "Tell me something. How did you know to look at Clause 17? For a moment, no one in the room moved. Richard Whitmore's question seemed to hang in the air like a weight that had nowhere to fall. Naomi Carter did not answer immediately. She looked down at the closed notebook resting beneath her hands, then slowly lifted her eyes toward the chief executive officer. Her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were considering how much she should say. Charles Langford let out a sharp breath and leaned forward in his chair. "Richard," he said quickly, "with all respect, this is getting ridiculous. She is a temporary note-taker. She has no role in this negotiation and certainly no understanding of the financial structure behind this agreement." Several executives shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to support Charles or remain silent. Richard Whitmore did not take his eyes off Naomi. "Miss Carter," He repeated gently, "How did you know to look at Clause 17? Naomi rested her hands lightly on the notebook. "Because that is where the leverage is," she answered quietly. The room went still again. Charles Langford laughed under his breath, though the sound carried less confidence than before. "Leverage," he repeated. "That is a word people use when they do not actually understand what they are reading." Naomi did not react to the comment. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward the contract in Richard Whitmore's hands. "Most acquisition agreements focus attention on the valuation," she continued calmly. "Everyone reads the numbers at the beginning. Everyone studies the ownership percentages at the end. But the real control often hides in the middle." A few of the analysts near the wall exchanged quick glances. One of them quietly reopened the digital contract and began scrolling again toward the section Richard Whitmore had been examining. Charles Langford's voice sharpened. "Richard, this is a waste of time. We have a signed commitment from our investors waiting for confirmation. If we delay now, we risk losing the entire deal." Richard Whitmore finally leaned back in his chair. His gaze remained steady on Naomi Carter. "What exactly does Clause 17 do, Miss Carter?" he asked. Naomi paused for a moment before answering. "It shifts the debt control structure," she said. "Not just the debt itself, but the authority to enforce it." Charles shook his head with visible irritation. "That is standard financial engineering. Every large acquisition uses some form of debt transfer." Naomi nodded slightly. "That is true," she said, "but the structure in this contract is unusual." She turned her attention toward the analysts near the wall. "When the restructuring is completed, the holding entity gains priority claim over the company assets if the debt obligations are triggered." One of the analysts looked up from his tablet with widened eyes. "Sir," he said quietly to Richard Whitmore, "that interpretation appears correct. The clause does not simply consolidate the debt. It gives enforcement authority to the holding entity if the payment schedule fails." Charles Langford's hands tightened against the armrest of his chair. "That is hypothetical risk language," he snapped. "It only activates under extreme financial distress." Richard Whitmore slowly closed the contract and placed it on the table in front of him. "And who controls the holding entity that receives that authority?" he asked again. Charles hesitated for the briefest moment. "The investors behind the acquisition," he said firmly. Naomi Carter's voice remained calm when she spoke again. "That depends on who controls the debt after the restructuring is completed." Charles turned sharply toward her. "You are making assumptions about financial instruments you clearly do not understand." Naomi finally stood from her chair. The movement was slow and unhurried, yet it changed the entire balance of the room. Until that moment, she had been seated quietly at the edge of the meeting like a shadow no one needed to notice. Now every pair of eyes in the boardroom followed her. She picked up her notebook and held it lightly against her side. "I understand more than you think," she said softly. Charles gave a tight smile. "Then perhaps you should explain it to the room." Naomi Carter looked across the long table toward Richard Whitmore before answering. "Because once you see what Clause 17 really does," she said quietly, "you will realize this deal was never meant to give the company to the investors sitting behind you." The words Naomi Carter had just spoken settled over the boardroom like a slow-moving storm. No one laughed this time. No one dismissed her. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Charles Langford stared at her as if he were trying to decide whether she was bluffing or simply reckless. Richard Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his fingers resting lightly on the closed contract while his eyes followed Naomi Carter as she stood beside her chair. For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to forget that she had been hired only to record the meeting. Charles was the first to speak again. His voice carried a sharper edge now. "That is a serious accusation to make in a room like this, Miss Carter." Naomi met his gaze without raising her voice. "I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply explained what the contract does." Charles leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. "Then perhaps you should clarify your claim," he said. "Because from where I am sitting, this deal transfers Whitmore Financial to a consortium of investors that we negotiated with for months." Naomi nodded slowly. "That is what the summary documents say." Richard Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair. "Summary documents," he repeated. Naomi looked toward him and spoke carefully. The executive summary focuses on the equity transfer and the public ownership percentage. That is the part everyone reads first. But the real leverage in this deal is not the equity. It is the debt structure. One of the analysts at the far end of the table leaned closer to his tablet again. The digital pages reflected in his glasses as he scrolled back through the agreement. Naomi continued speaking in the same calm tone. Clause 17 creates a secondary holding entity that receives the majority claim over the company debt once the restructuring is completed. If Whitmore Financial fails to meet the new payment schedule, the holding entity gains the right to enforce that debt claim against the company assets. Charles Langford lifted his chin. That is standard creditor protection language. Naomi shook her head slightly. Not when the payment schedule is structured the way this contract defines it. The analysts near the wall began whispering to each other as they studied the financial schedule attached to the clause. One of them spoke quietly to Richard Whitmore. Sir, the repayment timeline becomes extremely aggressive once the restructuring activates. Richard Whitmore frowned slightly. Aggressive how? The analyst hesitated before answering. The company would need to generate significantly higher revenue within the first year of a new structure, or the holding entity would gain enforcement authority over the assets. Charles Langford quickly raised his voice. That is speculation. The projections clearly show that Whitmore Financial can handle the payment schedule. Naomi finally stepped forward from her place beside the chair and approached the edge of the long table. She placed her notebook down gently beside the contract. Projections are based on assumptions, she said. Contracts are based on obligations. Richard Whitmore slowly reopened the agreement and turned again to the section Naomi had mentioned. The words on the page now felt heavier than they had earlier in the meeting. Charles watched him carefully. Richard, he said with forced calm, we have spent months negotiating this deal. Our investors are prepared to move forward today. If we delay now, we risk losing the opportunity entirely. Richard Whitmore looked up from the document. His eyes moved between Charles and Naomi. Miss Carter, he said quietly, if this structure is as dangerous as you claim, then who exactly benefits from it? Naomi Carter rested her hands lightly on the table. Her voice remained steady. The party that ultimately controls the debt claim. Charles gave a dismissive wave. The investors behind the acquisition control that claim. Naomi looked directly at him now. That is what you believe, she said. But the contract does not actually say that. Several executives leaned forward at the same time. Richard Whitmore flipped to the final page of the clause and read the ownership description of the holding entity again. His expression slowly changed. The ownership line was written in dense legal language that referenced a layered acquisition channel connected to an external debt purchase agreement. Richard Whitmore looked up again. Charles, he said slowly, when exactly was this debt purchase agreement executed? Charles hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. But in that silent fraction of a second, Naomi Carter answered the question for him. Last month, she said quietly, and the party that purchased the controlling debt was not the investors in this room. The words Naomi Carter had spoken lingered in the air, like a quiet explosion that had not yet reached its full force. Several executives looked toward Charles Langford at the same time, waiting for him to deny what she had implied. Charles did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened, and the confident posture he had carried throughout the meeting shifted slightly in his chair. Richard Whitmore leaned forward again, the contract open before him, his finger resting on the dense block of legal language describing the layered acquisition channel. Last month, Richard repeated slowly. Naomi Carter gave a small nod. Yes, sir. The silence in the room deepened. One of the analysts near the wall cleared his throat and spoke cautiously. Sir, if the debt-controlling stake was purchased by a separate party before this meeting, then whoever holds that debt would ultimately control enforcement authority over Whitmore Financial if the restructuring triggers the repayment clause. Charles Langford suddenly pushed his chair back a few inches. This is absurd, he said sharply. That clause was negotiated to protect our investors from market volatility. It does not transfer ownership. Naomi Carter turned slightly toward him. Ownership is not always transferred through equity, she said calmly. Sometimes it moves through pressure. Richard Whitmore slowly closed the contract again. His expression was no longer simply curious. It had hardened into the focused look of a man who was beginning to realize that something important had been hidden from him. "Charles," he said quietly, "when this deal closes, the investors acquire the equity. But if the payment schedule fails, the holding entity gains the right to enforce the debt." Charles folded his arms across his chest. "Correct. That is creditor protection." Richard Whitmore, eyes narrowed slightly. "And whoever owns the controlling debt decides when enforcement begins." Charles did not respond. Instead, he looked across the table toward Naomi Carter with visible irritation. "You're making this sound like some kind of trap," he said. Naomi did not raise her voice. "I am saying that the contract was designed so that the person who controls the debt eventually controls the company." One of the senior executives at the far end of the table leaned forward in his chair. "Richard," he said slowly, "if that is true, then we need to know exactly who purchased that debt position last month." The analyst beside him looked up from his tablet again. "The acquisition channel referenced in Clause 17 leads to an external entity called Carter Capital Holdings." The room went silent again. Charles Langford blinked once, then forced a thin smile. "Carter Capital is simply a financing partner that assisted with the restructuring preparation." Naomi Carter looked down briefly at the notebook she had placed on the table earlier. Then she lifted her eyes again and spoke with the same quiet certainty she had carried since the beginning of the meeting. "Carter Capital did more than assist." Richard Whitmore's attention moved instantly toward her. "What do you mean?" Naomi rested her fingertips lightly on the edge of the table. "Carter Capital purchased the majority of Whitmore financial debt obligations during the secondary market sale that occurred last month." One of the executives whispered under his breath in surprise. "That kind of purchase would require enormous capital." Charles Langford's voice grew tight. "That transaction was part of the preparation for the acquisition. The investors needed to stabilize the debt position before the equity transfer could move forward." Naomi Carter tilted her head slightly. "That is one way to describe it." Richard Whitmore looked directly at her now. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "how do you know who purchased that debt?" Naomi Carter did not hesitate this time. "Because I was the one who authorized the purchase." For a moment, the entire boardroom froze. The executives looked at her as if they had suddenly realized they were seeing a different person than the quiet note-taker who had been sitting in the corner only minutes earlier. Charles Langford stared at her in disbelief. "That is impossible," he said. Naomi Carter simply met his gaze. "Carter Capital Holdings belongs to me." For several seconds, no one in the boardroom spoke. The air felt heavier than before, as if the room itself had become aware that something fundamental had just shifted. Naomi Carter's words did not sound dramatic. She had spoken them quietly, almost casually, yet the meaning behind them rippled through the executives like a shockwave moving beneath still water. "Carter Capital Holdings belongs to me." Charles Langford was the first to react. He laughed, but the sound was sharp and brittle like glass under pressure. "That is not funny," he said. His voice tried to hold authority, but the confidence that had filled it earlier was gone. Naomi Carter did not smile. "I was not trying to be funny," she replied. Around the long mahogany table, the executives exchanged uncertain glances. A few of them turned toward Richard Whitmore, as if waiting for him to restore order to the room. Richard Whitmore did not immediately speak. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi Carter, studying her in a way that was very different from how he had looked at her earlier in the meeting. When she first walked into the room that morning, she had been the quiet woman hired to record the minutes. Now he was looking at her, as if he were seeing someone entirely new. "You authorized the debt purchase," he said slowly. Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing the implication. The controlling debt position of Whitmore Financial was not small. Acquiring it would require enormous capital and access to complex financial channels that only a handful of institutions in the country could manage. Charles Langford shook his head in disbelief. "That is impossible," he said again. "Carter Capital is a shell structure used in the restructuring plan." Naomi Carter turned her gaze toward him. It was a shell structure until last month, she said calmly. That was when it acquired the majority of the debt obligations tied to Whitmore Financial. One of the senior executives near the middle of the table spoke quietly. If that is true, then Carter Capital holds the enforcement authority if the repayment schedule fails. Naomi nodded again. Correct. Another executive leaned forward. And if the enforcement authority is activated, the controlling debt holder gains the ability to seize company assets through the restructuring agreement. Richard Whitmore slowly closed the contract and placed both hands on the table. Miss Carter, he said, purchasing that level of debt would require billions of dollars. Naomi Carter's expression remained steady. That is correct. Charles Langford's voice rose slightly. This is absurd. Even if you had access to that kind of capital, you would never gain approval to enter this meeting under false pretenses. Naomi looked at him quietly for a moment before answering. I did not enter under false pretenses. I was invited to observe the meeting as part of the documentation process. Charles opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when Richard Whitmore raised a hand slightly. Let her finish, Richard said. Naomi Carter continued in the same calm voice. Carter Capital purchased the controlling portion of Whitmore Financial debt through the secondary credit market after the initial restructuring announcement lowered the bond prices. Several executives around the table began murmuring quietly. The move she described was aggressive, but not impossible. If someone had enough capital and the right timing, they could accumulate a large portion of the company debt before the board even realized it was happening. Richard Whitmore watched her closely. Why would you do that? He asked. Naomi Carter rested one hand lightly against the edge of the table. Because once someone controls the debt, they control the leverage behind every decision that follows. Charles Langford pushed his chair back again, anger now replacing disbelief. You are claiming to hold the most powerful position in this transaction, he said. Naomi Carter met his gaze without raising her voice. I'm not claiming it. The room fell silent once more. Naomi Carter picked up the contract from the table and gently turned it toward Richard Whitmore. I am explaining it, she said. The contract slid quietly across the polished surface of the table until it stopped in front of Richard Whitmore. Naomi Carter's hand moved away from it with calm precision, as if she had simply returned a document that already belonged there. For a moment, no one in the room touched it. The executives were no longer looking at charts or tablets. Every eye was fixed on Naomi Carter. Richard Whitmore slowly opened the document again, his fingers turning back to Clause 17. He read the language once more, but this time the words carried an entirely different meaning. Charles Langford stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. This is manipulation, he said sharply. You cannot simply walk into a corporate board meeting, claim ownership of a financing structure, and expect anyone here to believe it. Naomi Carter did not move. She watched him with the same calm expression she had carried since the beginning of the meeting. I did not walk in and claim it, she said. The purchase documents were filed weeks ago. One of the analysts at the wall hesitated before speaking. Sir, he said to Richard Whitmore, if Carter Capital acquired the controlling portion of the debt position, then the enforcement rights referenced in Clause 17 would legally belong to that entity. Charles turned toward the analyst with visible anger. You are speculating about information you do not have. The analyst swallowed, but kept his eyes on the tablet in his hands. The market records show a large acquisition of Whitmore Financial debt through a private channel last month, he said quietly. The purchasing entity was Carter Capital Holdings. The room grew even quieter. Richard Whitmore looked back up at Naomi Carter. If that is true, he said slowly, then you hold the leverage behind this agreement. Naomi nodded once. Yes, sir. Charles Langford shook his head again. Even if you somehow purchased that debt, it does not give you the right to interfere in this transaction. The equity still transfers to the investors represented in this room. Naomi Carter tilted her head slightly as she answered. Only if the company can meet the new payment schedule defined in the restructuring clause. Richard Whitmore closed the contract again and rested both hands on the table. And if the company cannot meet it, he asked quietly. Naomi Carter's voice remained steady. Then the controlling debt holder gains enforcement authority. One of the executives whispered under his breath as the meaning settled in. Enforcement authority meant the power to force restructuring, seize assets, or claim ownership through the debt agreement itself. Charles Langford pointed toward Naomi with frustration. This entire argument assumes the company would fail the payment schedule. Our projections clearly show strong growth next year. Naomi Carter looked at him without anger. Projections depend on perfect conditions, she said. Contracts depend on reality. Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly, absorbing the weight of the situation. The deal that had seemed simple an hour earlier now looked far more complicated. If Carter Capital controlled the debt and the contract triggered enforcement rights under financial pressure, the person behind that entity could ultimately control the company without ever buying the equity directly. One of the senior executives spoke carefully. Miss Carter, if your firm truly controls the debt position, then you're already in the most powerful seat in this negotiation. Naomi Carter rested her hand lightly on the notebook she had brought into the meeting that morning. That is correct. Charles Langford stared at her in disbelief. Then why are you sitting there taking notes like a secretary? He demanded. Naomi Carter looked around the room slowly, meeting the eyes of each executive who had ignored her earlier. Because before someone signs a contract like this, she said quietly, I like to see who actually understands it. Richard Whitmore exhaled slowly as the realization spread across the room. The quiet woman who had been recording their meeting was no longer just an observer. She had been watching them evaluate a deal that could ultimately place the company in her hands. The boardroom no longer felt like a place where a routine corporate vote was about to happen. The polished table, the glowing screens, the expensive suits all remained exactly where they had been an hour earlier. Yet the atmosphere had shifted in a way none of the executives could ignore. Naomi Carter still stood near the table with her notebook resting beside the contract. But the way the room looked at her now was completely different. She was no longer the quiet observer who had been asked to record the minutes. She had become the center of the negotiation itself. Richard Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlocked as he studied her carefully. Miss Carter, he said slowly, if your firm truly controls the debt structure behind this agreement, then the future of this company does not depend on the investors Charles brought into this room. Naomi Carter nodded once. That is correct. One of the senior executives near the middle of the table spoke with visible concern. That would mean the equity transfer we are about to vote on is only part of the story. Naomi answered calmly. The equity transfer creates the appearance of ownership. The debt structure creates the reality of control. Charles Langford slammed his palm lightly against the table. This is a distortion of the agreement, he said sharply. The investors behind this acquisition have already committed enormous capital to this company. Naomi looked toward him, without raising her voice. And they will still receive the equity stake described in the agreement if the company can sustain the repayment schedule. Charles narrowed his eyes. If. Naomi did not hesitate. Yes. The word hung in the air for a moment. Richard Whitmore turned the contract again toward himself and flipped back through the repayment section attached to Clause 17. The numbers he had skimmed earlier now felt different. The payment schedule increased sharply after the first year of restructuring. The growth projections required to meet those payments were ambitious even under strong market conditions. One of the analysts spoke again, his voice careful. Sir, if revenue growth falls short of those projections, the repayment schedule could place significant pressure on the company financial structure. Charles turned toward the analyst with frustration. That is a theoretical scenario. Richard Whitmore did not look up from the document. Theoretical scenarios are exactly why contracts like this exist, he said quietly. The room fell silent again. Naomi Carter rested both hands lightly against the edge of the table. She was not smiling, but there was a quiet steadiness in her posture that made several executives uneasy. Richard Whitmore finally closed the document again. Miss Carter, he said, if the company struggles to meet the repayment obligations, then Carter Capital would have the right to enforce the debt claim. Naomi nodded. Yes, sir. One of the executives leaned forward with growing realization. And if the debt claim is enforced, the controlling creditor gains the authority to restructure ownership through asset control. Naomi looked toward him and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. That is how creditor leverage works. Charles Langford shook his head angrily. This entire conversation assumes failure. Whitmore Financial is not a failing company. Naomi answered quietly. I never said it was. Richard Whitmore looked at her carefully. Then why create a structure that could take control of the company if it fails? Naomi Carter paused before answering. Because when a company enters a major transition like this one, the real question is not whether it will survive. The real question is who will guide it if things become difficult. One of the executives whispered to another beside him as the meaning of her words settled across the table. Richard Whitmore exhaled slowly. Earlier today, everyone in this room believed Charles Langford had negotiated the future of Whitmore Financial with outside investors. Now it appeared that the most powerful position in the entire deal belonged to the quiet woman who had been writing in a notebook at the end of the table. Charles looked at Naomi again with disbelief. Even if everything you say is true, he said, that still does not explain why you came into this room pretending to be a note-taker. Naomi Carter looked around the boardroom once more before answering. I did not come here pretending to be anything, she said softly. I came here to watch who was about to sign away control of the company without realizing who already held it. The boardroom felt smaller now, even though the wide windows still revealed the endless skyline beyond the glass. No one had left their seat, yet the energy in the room had changed completely. What had begun as a routine vote had turned into something far more complicated. Richard Whitmore rested both hands on the table, his eyes moving slowly from the contract to Naomi Carter. For several seconds, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a calm weight that commanded the room. Miss Carter, he said, if everything you have explained is accurate, then this agreement does not simply sell Whitmore Financial. Naomi Carter answered without hesitation. It transfers the appearance of ownership while placing the real leverage somewhere else. Charles Langford leaned forward again, his frustration now visible to everyone. This is speculation built on clever interpretation of legal language, he said sharply. The investors I represent have committed enormous capital to this transaction. Naomi Carter turned her attention toward him. Capital does not guarantee control when the debt structure holds the real authority. Richard Whitmore lifted the contract again and studied the repayment section for a long moment. The financial schedule looked aggressive now that he examined it carefully. The company would need unusually strong growth during the first year of restructuring to meet the new obligations. Even a small downturn in the market could create pressure. He closed the contract again and placed it flat on the table. Charles, he said slowly, why did you push so hard to close this deal today? Charles stared back at him, clearly surprised by the question. Because the investors want certainty and stability, he replied. Richard Whitmore nodded slightly, but his expression remained thoughtful. Certainty for whom? The room went silent again. Naomi Carter watched the exchange quietly, her posture relaxed but attentive. One of the senior executives leaned closer to the contract again and whispered something to the analyst beside him. Richard Whitmore looked back at Naomi. When you purchased the controlling debt position last month, he asked, what did you expect would happen in this room today? Naomi Carter answered in the same calm voice she had used since the beginning of the meeting. I expected someone to read the agreement carefully before signing it. A faint ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through one end of the table, though it faded quickly. Charles Langford shook his head. Even if Carter Capital owns the debt, it does not give you the authority to control Whitmore Financial today. Naomi did not argue. That depends on what happens next, she said. Richard Whitmore studied her carefully. You mean whether the company signs this agreement? Naomi gave a small nod. Yes, sir. Charles pushed his chair slightly closer to the table again, his voice tightening. Richard, do not lose sight of what this deal represents. The investors behind this acquisition are prepared to move Whitmore Financial into a new phase of growth. If we hesitate now, we risk losing their support entirely. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly. For months, he had trusted Charles Langford to guide the negotiations. Yet the information Naomi Carter had revealed was impossible to ignore. If Carter Capital truly controlled the debt behind the restructuring, then the entire balance of the deal had changed. The equity investors might believe they were acquiring the company, but the person holding the debt could ultimately decide the company's future if the financial pressure built. Richard Whitmore looked once more at Naomi Carter. Earlier today, everyone in this room believed you were here to record our meeting, he said. Naomi Carter rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table. That is what most people assumed. Richard Whitmore nodded slowly. Then perhaps the most important question has not been asked yet. The room waited as he continued. If Carter Capital already holds the leverage behind this agreement, he said, what exactly do you intend to do with it? Naomi Carter looked around the table once more, meeting the eyes of the executives who had ignored her only an hour earlier. Then she answered quietly, I intend to make sure this company belongs to the people who actually understand how it works. The silence that followed Naomi Carter's words felt different from the earlier pauses in the meeting. Before, the room had been confused. Now, the executives were thinking. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table with the contract still in front of him, but he no longer looked at it. Instead, his attention remained on Naomi Carter, as if he were slowly re-examining every assumption he had made since the meeting began. Around the table, several of the executives shifted in their chairs. A few glanced again at the financial schedules on their tablets. What Naomi had revealed had not been dramatic speculation. It had been structure. The kind of structure that quietly decided the future of companies long before anyone realized it. Charles Langford was the first to break the silence again. His voice was lower now, but the tension inside, it was unmistakable. Even if Carter Capital owns the debt position, he said, the equity investors still control the board once this agreement closes. Naomi Carter turned slightly toward him. That is correct if the company meets every obligation defined in the repayment schedule. Charles exhaled sharply. Whitmore Financial has survived market downturns before. Richard Whitmore finally spoke again, his voice thoughtful rather than defensive. Yes, we have, but we have never taken on a repayment structure this aggressive. One of the analysts nodded quietly beside the wall. Sir, the repayment schedule increases significantly after the first year of restructuring. The company would need exceptional growth to remain comfortably within those obligations. Charles leaned forward. Exceptional growth is exactly what the investors intend to deliver. Naomi Carter rested her hands lightly on the table. Intentions are not the same as outcomes. The statement was quiet, but it settled across the room with weight. Richard Whitmore looked again at the contract and then back toward Naomi. Miss Carter, he said slowly, when you purchased the controlling debt position, you must have expected the company might struggle under this repayment structure. Naomi considered the question for a moment before answering. I expected the company to face pressure during the transition. Richard Whitmore studied her expression carefully. And when that pressure appears, Carter Capital would have the legal authority to intervene through the enforcement clause. Naomi nodded once. That is how creditor leverage works. Charles Langford pushed his chair back again, clearly frustrated. So this entire plan was designed to trap the company in a financial squeeze until you could take control. Naomi Carter shook her head slightly. No, the plan was designed to prevent the company from being sold to people who did not understand its long-term value. Several executives looked up at that statement. Richard Whitmore leaned forward again. You believe the investors Charles represents would harm the company. Naomi answered calmly. I believe their strategy focuses on short-term extraction rather than long-term growth. Charles stood again, anger now visible in his posture. That is an outrageous accusation. The investors behind this acquisition have built successful companies across the country. Naomi met his gaze steadily. They have also dismantled several of them. The room grew quiet once more. One of the senior executives near the end of the table spoke carefully. Miss Carter, if Carter Capital holds the controlling debt position and the enforcement clause activates under financial pressure, then the final decision about Whitmore Financial future would rest with you. Naomi Carter did not hesitate. Yes, Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair as the realization settled across the boardroom. For the past hour, the executives had debated whether to sell their company to outside investors. Now it appeared that the real question was much simpler. They had never been negotiating with those investors at all. They had been negotiating with a quiet woman who had been taking notes at the end of the table. Charles Langford looked toward Richard Whitmore with urgency. "Richard, this conversation is distracting us from the real decision. The investors expect us to finalize the agreement today." Richard Whitmore looked down at the contract again. Then he slowly pushed the document away from himself. "The decision may already have been made before this meeting even began," he said quietly. Naomi Carter watched him for a moment before speaking again. "The difference now," she said, "is that everyone in this room finally understands who actually holds the power to make it." No one in the boardroom spoke for several long seconds after Richard Whitmore pushed the contract away from him. The movement was small, almost quiet, yet it carried more weight than any speech that had been given during the meeting. For months, this agreement had been treated as the inevitable future of Whitmore Financial. Now the document rested on the polished table like something dangerous that no one wanted to touch. Richard Whitmore folded his hands together and slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi Carter. "Earlier today, you were introduced as the person recording the minutes of this meeting," he said. Naomi Carter gave a small nod. "That is correct." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Yet the person holding the controlling debt position of this company is standing in this room." Naomi did not interrupt. Richard continued. "If Carter Capital controls the debt enforcement authority described in Clause 17, then the power to reshape this company during financial pressure ultimately rests with you." Naomi answered calmly. "That is how the contract was written." Charles Langford could no longer remain seated. He stood again with visible frustration, pacing once beside his chair before turning toward Richard Whitmore. "This entire situation is absurd," he said sharply. "The investors I represent negotiated this acquisition in good faith. They are expecting this board to finalize the transfer today." Richard Whitmore turned his head toward him slowly. "Charles," he said quietly, "what they expected and what is actually happening may not be the same thing." Charles opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when one of the senior executives at the end of the table spoke carefully. "Richard, if Carter Capital already holds the controlling debt, then the board must consider how that affects the company's long-term stability." Several others nodded in agreement. The discussion had shifted. Only an hour earlier, the executives had debated the benefits of selling the company. Now, they were debating who truly held the authority to guide its future. Naomi Carter remained standing beside the table with the same calm posture she had maintained since revealing the truth. She was not raising her voice or demanding anything from the room. She was simply allowing them to see the structure that had been hidden inside the contract. Richard Whitmore looked down briefly at the document before him and then back toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "if this agreement is signed today, the equity transfers to the investors Charles represents." Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." Richard continued. "Yet if the company faces pressure under the repayment schedule, your firm gains the authority to intervene through the debt enforcement clause." "That is correct," Naomi replied. One of the analysts spoke quietly again. "Sir, that would mean the company future could ultimately depend on Carter Capital decision rather than the investors who believe they are purchasing it." Charles Langford shook his head in frustration. "This is a distortion of the deal structure." Richard Whitmore turned toward him again. "Or perhaps it is the part of the structure we failed to examine closely enough." The room grew quiet once more. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time since the meeting began, the executives were no longer rushing toward a vote. They were thinking about the consequences behind every line of the agreement. Naomi Carter watched them quietly before speaking again. "I did not come here to embarrass anyone," she said. "I came here because decisions like this shape companies for decades." Richard Whitmore studied her expression carefully. "And if the board chooses not to sign this agreement today," he asked, "what happens then?" Naomi Carter answered without hesitation. "Then the company remains exactly where it is today." Richard nodded slowly. And Carter Capital still holds the controlling debt position. Naomi met his gaze calmly. Yes, sir. One of the executives whispered softly under his breath as the final realization settled across the room. The board had spent months negotiating a sale they believed would decide the future of Whitmore Financial. Yet the quiet woman who had been sitting in the corner with a notebook had already positioned herself at the center of that future long before the meeting ever began. Richard Whitmore looked once more at the contract and then pushed it a little farther away from him. It appears this meeting was never about selling the company after all, he said quietly. Naomi Carter gave a small nod of acknowledgement. No, sir, she replied. It was about whether the people in this room would recognize who already had the power to protect it. The boardroom remained silent after Naomi Carter's last words settled into the air. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon light had begun to soften, casting long reflections across the skyline of Manhattan. Inside the room, no one reached for the contract again. Richard Whitmore slowly exhaled and looked down at the agreement one final time before closing it completely. The sound of the folder shutting echoed across the quiet table. That sound alone told everyone in the room what the decision would be. Charles Langford stared at him in disbelief. Richard, he said sharply, you cannot be serious. Months of negotiations cannot end like this. Richard Whitmore lifted his eyes calmly. They're not ending, Charles. They're simply being understood for the first time. Around the table, several executives shifted in their seats, the tension that had filled the meeting slowly transforming into something closer to clarity. One of the senior directors leaned forward and spoke carefully. Richard, if Carter Capital already controls the majority of the company debt, then signing this agreement would only create unnecessary pressure on Whitmore Financial during the transition. Another executive nodded. We would essentially be placing the company under a structure that allows outside investors to take profits while the real control sits somewhere else entirely. Charles Langford shook his head again, frustration burning in his voice. The investors I represent will walk away if this agreement is not signed today. Naomi Carter finally spoke again, her voice calm but steady. Then perhaps they were never the right investors for this company. The room fell quiet again as the meaning of her words settled across the table. Richard Whitmore slowly stood from his chair. When the chief executive officer rose, the rest of the room instinctively straightened. For months he had believed he was about to sell the future of the company he had spent decades building. Now he realized that the future had already shifted before the meeting even began. Miss Carter, he said thoughtfully, you positioned Carter Capital behind the debt structure before anyone in this room realized what was happening. Naomi Carter nodded slightly. I studied Whitmore Financial for years before making that decision. Richard looked at her carefully. And what do you intend to do now that the leverage is yours? Naomi rested one hand lightly on the notebook she had carried into the meeting that morning. I intend to protect the company from being dismantled by short-term strategies, she said. The executives around the table exchanged glances. What she had done was bold, but it was not reckless. She had not forced control through chaos. She had quietly built leverage until the company future depended on her judgment. Charles Langford gathered his documents with visible anger. This meeting is finished, he said coldly. Richard Whitmore shook his head once. No, Charles. This meeting has only just begun. He turned toward Naomi Carter again. If Carter Capital holds the controlling debt position, he said, then the most logical path forward is simple. He paused briefly before finishing the thought. Instead of selling Whitmore Financial to outside investors, perhaps the company should work with the person who already holds the leverage to guide its future. Naomi Carter considered the room for a moment before answering. That depends on whether the leadership of this company is willing to focus on long-term growth rather than short-term exits. Richard Whitmore gave a small nod. That has always been my intention. For the first time since the meeting began, Naomi Carter allowed a faint smile to appear. Then perhaps we should start discussing how to rebuild this company the right way. Richard Whitmore looked down at the closed contract one last time before sliding it aside. Earlier today, everyone in this room believed the quiet woman taking notes had no power at all. Now the truth was clear. She had not come to watch the meeting. She had come to decide the future of the company.